The Subcommittee on Healthcare Benefits and Administrative Rules and the Subcommittee on Government Operations will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time, and we will certainly have to do that in a few minutes because votes are going to be coming. We want to thank our witnesses, and we'll get to you in just a minute. You know how this works. We do the opening statements, then we get to your important statements. But even before that, the Chair notes the presence of our colleague, Congressman Raskin of Maryland. We appreciate your interest in this topic and welcome your participation today. I ask unanimous consent that Congressman Raskin be allowed to fully participate in today's hearing without objection. So ordered. We'll do a quick opening statement, and then we'll turn to our ranking member for the same, and then we'll try to get through as many of you as we can before we have to recess for votes. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We convened this hearing to highlight the First Amendment and examine those places in our great country where that right to free speech is being stifled and sometimes even silenced by government. And unfortunately, this is nothing new. In the recent past, we've seen the IRS bogging down conservative social welfare organizations, that's a nice way of saying it, with an endless application process, holding them in bureaucratic limbo for years and thereby curbing their First Amendment rights. Never forget what they did. Systematically and for a sustained period of time, targeted people for their political beliefs. That should not happen in our great country. We've seen public universities not allowing conservative voices to be heard. And we've seen government agencies levy enormous fines for small, many times even returned campaign donations for candidates who might not have even made it on the ballot. The First Amendment is the First Amendment for a reason. Our founders knew the ability to criticize our government was of paramount importance. We must never forget those great words. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. To be clear, this freedom doesn't just protect a citizen's right to speak out in the town square. It also protects speech. Maybe it's a poster you draw, maybe it's where you choose to give your money, maybe even what you wear. Since our founding, nonprofits, like churches, have had the ability to speak freely and educate their membership about candidates or policies that align or contradict their interests and values. That was until 1954, when, as a political retribution, then-Senator Johnson, with no real debate, had inserted language into a tax law that would bar nonprofits from speaking in a political manner. Since then, churches and other C3s have had to decide whether or not to directly violate the law and risk potentially losing their tax status altogether, or to practice a, quote, studied vagueness or self-censorship, trying to carefully navigate what would or would not draw the attention of the IRS speech cop. Today we begin what I hope will be a series of hearings on the First Amendment and where government agencies may in fact be infringing and limiting individuals' First Amendment liberties. So we look forward to this series of hearings. We look forward to what we're going to hear today from our witnesses. And with that, I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I strongly support the exercise of free speech by all, including churches and other charitable organizations. In fact, there was a news item today. It has been reported that President Trump will issue an executive order to redirect or direct the IRS to use its discretion in enforcing the Johnson Amendment. In fact, this order will have little effect. IRS rarely brings enforcement actions against houses of worship that engage in political activity. But this hearing is about something far more significant than the president's actions. Only Congress can make changes to the law. And today's hearing is about what changes the Republican majority will attempt to make to the tax deductibility of political contributions and whether those changes are justified. Furthermore, what would be the intended and unintended consequences of those changes? That will be the subject of this hearing. This hearing is not about free speech. It is about a scheme to flood political campaigns with dark money. Let's be clear. Current law does not prevent churches or charities from speaking out on any issue. They can speak about all the hot-button issues of the day. They can lobby the government. In fact, a group of 99 religious and denominational organizations recently sent a letter to congressional leadership explaining that they are currently able to, and I quote, use their pulpits to address the moral and political issues of the day. They also can, in their personal capacities and without the resources of their houses of worship, endorse and oppose political candidates. Houses of worship can engage in public debate on any issue, host candidate forums, engage in voter registration drives, encourage people to vote, help transport people to the polls, and even, with a few boundaries, lobby on specific legislation and invite candidates to speak. I ask unanimous consent that the letter written by 99 religious and denominational organizations be entered into the hearing record.
Without objection, so ordered.
In other words, current law does not restrain the freedom of speech of houses of worship. However, and this is important, current law does prohibit fat cat political spenders from laundering their contributions through churches and nonprofits and getting a tax deduction to boot. But that is what some in this room want to do. They want to funnel dark money to the political system through churches. In short, this hearing is about money, not speech, pure and simple. Over 1,000 national and state nonprofit organizations wrote a letter to Congress saying that current law, quote, shields the entire 501c3 community against the rancor of partisan politics so the charitable community can be a safe haven where individuals of all beliefs come together to solve community problems free from partisan divisions. It screens out doubts and suspicions regarding ulterior partisan motives of charitable organizations, as undoubtedly would occur if even just a few charitable organizations engaged in partisan politics. I ask unanimous consent that the letter written to us by nonprofit organizations be entered into the hearing record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Given that nonprofit organizations, including charities, churches, and other houses of worship, support existing law, which prevents churches and charities from becoming politicized, why would anyone want to alter the existing law? The answer? To expand the avenues through which dark money can flow into political campaigns. That is what this hearing is really about. The consequences would be severe. According to the nonprofit's letter, allowing political money into churches and nonprofits would, and I quote, damage the integrity and effectiveness of all charitable organizations and spawn litigation as innovative partisans seek to expand gray areas in the proposed legislation. In addition, the proposal, I quote, would damage the federal treasury as people take tax deductions for political contributions they could then funnel through charitable nonprofits, undercut fair elections by providing a loophole to avoid campaign contribution disclosure laws, and empower politicians to exert pressure for access to charitable foundation assets and charitable funds for their own partisan campaigns rather than the public good. So today's hearing is not about free speech. It is about a plan to inject more dark money in politics through churches and nonprofit organizations. This is a very, very bad idea. It will have a corrosive effect on the churches that become super PACs and pass-throughs for these campaign contributions. And it will further corrode our democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the chairman of the Subcommittee on Government Operations, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
I thank the chairman. I thank him for his leadership. I thank all of you for being here. Rabbi, it's good to have you back, I guess, in your non-official capacity, but it's great to have you back as well. I couldn't disagree more with the ranking member in terms of the intent. You know, when we look at this particular issue, it's about making sure that the churches have no voice at all. And if we do not address it the way that it goes, and many of you can speak to this far more eloquently than I can, but this is not about dark money. This is not about anything other than free speech and making sure that what has historically been the moral compass of this country from its very founding continues to be the voice for the American people. And so I would disagree with the characterization that is there. As we look at this, I look forward to hearing your expert testimony, and I'm going to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
Thank you very much, Chairman Meadows and Chairman Jordan, for having this joint hearing today. This is a critically important topic. It has to do with the federal tax code and the prohibitions therein directed towards 501c3 organizations, including churches and nonprofits and charitable organizations, from engaging in any political speech. It's been referred to as the Johnson Amendment, as Chairman referred to earlier. This amendment is an accident in our nation's history. It came about even under the full admission of the IRS as an attempt to get back to the opposition of a legislator. That's where this came from. And it has been used now for over 60 years as a bully stick to intimidate churches and charitable organizations into silence. Most of us are not aware of the selfish motive behind this amendment. Most people probably think that this is part of our tax code because it's rooted in the Jeffersonian principle of separation of church and state. But that's not where it came from. While it's true that our founders believed that our country should not establish a national church, they did establish the First Amendment, which prohibits any law from curbing the free exercise of religion, which has as its core the freedom of speech. So let's agree that even if the Jeffersonian wall exists, which today is, in my opinion, widely misinterpreted and misapplied, but even if that wall exists, it works both ways. And when government acts as the gatekeeper of speech, there is no free speech. The IRS should not be allowed to violate the Constitution, and for over 60 years now, they have done just that by being the gatekeeper, unfairly targeting pastors, churches, nonprofits, etc., with the tax-exempt status of those organizations being used as leverage to get these organizations not to speak on certain issues. Prior to being a member of Congress, I was a pastor. I know full well the extent to which the intimidation and the cloud of doubt that is laid over our heads on this issue censors so many individuals from being engaged. And not only is this whole thing unconstitutional, but the Johnson Amendment itself is extremely vague, which results in many people and organizations just censoring themselves right out of any involvement. And our system of government does not work without involvement of the people. And yet the Johnson Amendment has such a chilling effect through fear and intimidation from IRS threats. Even the U.S. Supreme Court acknowledged the harm that is produced by the vagueness of this law. And they stated in Virginia v. Hicks that many persons will choose simply to abstain from protected speech, harming not only themselves, but society as a whole. And that is indeed what has happened. The church's mission is undercut, not improved, when the IRS or the government comes in and begins editing what can and cannot be said. So let me be very clear on my final point, Mr. Chairman. Politicians should not get a free pass when it comes to moral scrutiny. And that takes place largely as people have the freedom to express their opinions and to weigh that scrutiny up to their religious beliefs. The absence of the Johnson Amendment does not mandate nor certainly license or allow a church to become a political action committee. The issue plainly is the choice to speak according to the dictates and convictions of one's heart without interference or threat or punishment or harassment from our government. To speak the conscience of an issue, especially in its relationship to the exercise of religion, is a cherished belief and foundation that we share as Americans, and it's simply not the role of government to police speech. While this is not a legislative hearing, it is for these reasons that Majority Whip Steve Scalise and I introduced H.R. 781, the Free Speech Fairness Act, which would provide a carve-out to the Johnson Amendment and allow 501c3 organizations to engage in political discourse in the normal course of business with de minimis associated expenses. And while I greatly appreciate the President's executive order today, directing the Department of Treasury and Justice on the Johnson Amendment, I believe it's time that we rid our nation of this unconstitutional law by way of legislative action. And with that, I look forward to this hearing. Thank you for being here today, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, thank Mr. Meadows as well, and Mr. Heiss and Congressman Heiss for his leadership on this issue for a number of years and his involvement with this particular issue. And now I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure the title of this hearing, Examining a Church's Right to a Free Speech, didn't mean to exclude my Hindu colleague next to me or my Jewish colleague in front of me, Mr. Raskin. I'm sure it was just an oversight because we're not just talking about churches. I'm a Roman Catholic. I studied for the priesthood too, Mr. Heiss, and my church is protected by this amendment. Your church wasn't accused of being a foreign entity or having allegiance to a foreign leader. Mine was. Your church has never been questioned in America about whether someone was qualified to be president of the United States. Mine was. We've suffered the sting of prejudice, religious prejudice. And frankly, if we'd been seen as a political agent, that prejudice would have magnified exponentially. So I have a different point of view based on my own experience growing up in Irish Catholic Boston. As a kid at 10 years old, having to read a headline in Time magazine and Newsweek magazine, asking the question, can a Catholic be president? Meaning our loyalty was subject to question. And that gentleman who became president had to go down to Texas and defend himself in front of a group of Protestant ministers. I don't want to return to that era. If people want to express themselves morally, great. There's no evidence proving that any houses of worship are unable to exercise free speech, or that any member of a house of worship, including clergy, are unable to speak freely on any social or moral issue they want to address. In fact, we hear a lot from them. Certainly, Mr. Ankali, if I'm pronouncing your name right, I've been with Tony Perkins on a platform. He didn't seem inhibited to me. In fact, despite what the misleading title of today's hearing is meant to suggest, the issue is not one of free speech. Under current law, churches and other houses of worship can speak freely and engage in partisan political activity. That's under current law. This hearing's not about free speech. It's about money. Under current law, churches do not pay taxes. Individuals who donate can claim deductions for their donations. Churches do not have to reveal publicly who they are. If the Johnson Amendment were to be repealed, as some are suggesting, 501c3 tax-exempt entities and their contributors would apparently be allowed to participate in political campaigns with tax-deductible donations. Under their new status, America would have more than 340,000 new political action committees. The new PACs that self-identify as houses of worship could maintain the anonymity of their donors, and the size of each donor's contribution would remain a secret. The repeal of the Johnson Amendment would not change the tax deductibility of donations to houses of worship. This means taxpayers would be subsidizing partisan political contributions. In other words, my colleagues are proposing to allow tax deductions now for those political contributions. Congress has examined this issue before and ultimately decided to rescind the tax deductibility of political contributions. That was during the Reagan years. Under Republican proposals, billionaires like Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers could give unlimited contributions to houses of worship to be directed toward their favorite candidates, and Democratic-leaning billionaires could do the same for Democrats. And all those billionaires could claim tax deductions for the political contributions, what they cannot do now. Of course, this would also put the ministers and leaders of houses of worship, I think, in untenable positions, because now they're not seen as moral men or women of faith. They're seen as political directors. partisan political directors. And I think in the long run, be careful what you ask, that will undermine religion in America in terms of confidence of the public. They'd be clergy members and simultaneously treasurers of PACs. They would be faith leaders and political operatives soliciting and maintaining and distributing millions of dollars to political campaigns. How would clergy members balance these competing roles? And how would churches, mosques, temples, synagogues, meeting houses, and cathedrals balance their members' interests in questions of faith and questions of campaign donations? Would they self-select into Republican and Democratic houses of worship? So you know if this denomination is speaking, it's a Republican, and if this one's speaking, it's a Democrat. That's what happened in the Civil War. And it took 100 years to heal those wounds. What we're really discussing is opening the floodgates to allow the flow of unlimited amounts of tax-deductible money from anonymous donors into political campaigns through houses of worship and diluting the mission and purpose of those religious institutions, all under the guise of free speech. I believe we should keep those floodgates firmly closed. According to a February 2017 Pew Research study, thousands of houses of worship, as well as the public at large, agree. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I want to thank you, and we'll hold the record open for 5 legislative days for members who would like to submit a written statement. Let's now turn to our panel of witnesses. Again, we want to thank you all for being here this morning. And I'm pleased to welcome Ms. Nkai. Nkai, all right. General Counsel for the Family Research Council, thank you for being with us. We have Ms. Catherine Engelbrecht for citizen of Cat Spring, Texas, and we have Ms. Christina Holcomb, Legal Counsel for the Alliance Defending Freedom, and we have Rabbi David Saperstein, former Director and Counsel, Religious Action Center. Welcome to you all, and pursuant to committee rules, that I should now stand, raise your right hand. We have to swear you in, and then we'll get right to our testimony. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Let the record show that each of our witnesses answered in the affirmative. And let's go to Ms. Nkai. You know how it works. You get 5 minutes, more or less. Prefer a little less, but that's fine. You take your 5 if you want, and then we'll move right down the dais there.
Chairman Jordan and members of the subcommittee, thank you for convening this hearing regarding the importance of protecting free speech rights of churches and other nonprofit organizations and their leaders. Churches and other 501c3 organizations have important roles in society, helping the sick, feeding the poor, counseling the downtrodden, ministering to people in need. Because of their special role in society, they are tax exempt. For almost 200 years, their work and tax-exempt status did not compromise their ability to speak freely about political candidates and issues. That is until 1954, when then-Senator Lyndon Johnson used his political power to weaken organizations politically opposed to him by conditioning nonprofit organizations' tax-exempt status on their remaining silent on political candidates. The Johnson Amendment bars 501c3 organizations from, quote, participating in or intervening in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. Since its passage, the Johnson Amendment has been used to muzzle and censor pastors and leaders of nonprofit organizations and to chill the political speech of tax-exempt organizations, religious and non-religious, on both sides of the aisle in a variety of ways. No one knows precisely what spoken or written comments on a candidate will draw an investigation by the IRS. This vagueness chills free speech. In 2005, All Saints Episcopal Church in California received a letter from the IRS because in 2004, a pastor there criticized President George Bush and the Iraq War. After 2 years of investigation, in 2007, the IRS closed the case without revoking the IRS tax-exempt letter, but indicated it thought the pastor's statements violated the law. I should note that FRC strongly opposed the Bush administration's targeting of All Saints Episcopal Church. In addition, the IRS has a history of enforcing the law in cases only to later refund the penalty paid by the tax-exempt organization. For example, in 2004, an organization called Catholic Answers posted 2 e-letters questioning whether then presidential candidate John Kerry, also a Catholic, should present himself for Holy Communion because of his position on abortion. The IRS investigated the comments and imposed excise taxes against the organization. However, the IRS later refunded the tax with interest, finding the organization's political activity was, quote, not willful and flagrant. This inconsistency causes confusion for tax-exempt organizations, is a wasteful use of IRS resources, and is why 501c3 nonprofit organizations should be able to engage in low-cost political communications free from the threat of government prosecutions and harassment. Pastors have historically been heavily involved in political matters. Since the birth of our nation, pastors and churches have been at the forefront of shaping public debate and voters' choices regarding their public servants. This began in 1776 with the Black Robe Regiment of pastors who also served as military leaders, and was forged during the desegregation movement when pastors like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out forcefully from the pulpit on political matters. Now, some pastors and organizational leaders may favor the Johnson Amendment. However, these pastors currently have the freedom to operate how they see fit. It is pastors who wish to make political campaign statements who are being muzzled. Pastors and nonprofit leaders who wish to speak out about political candidates should be free to do so. It is imperative that the free speech rights of pastors and nonprofit leaders be restored. In order to restore the First Amendment free speech rights of nonprofit organizations, including churches, it is necessary for Congress to act. February 1st of this year, Senator Lankford and Representatives Scalise and Heiss reintroduced the Free Speech Fairness Act to roll back the unconstitutional impact of the Johnson Amendment while still preventing churches from becoming about the money or political action committees. The Free Speech Fairness Act amends the Johnson Amendment to allow for political campaign speech that is made in the ordinary course of a 501c3 organization's regular and customary activities, so long as the activities carry out the tax-exempt organization's purpose, and so long as the organization does not incur more than de minimis incremental costs or trivial costs for the activity. Amending the Johnson Amendment in this way will allow 501c3 organizations, religious and non-religious, conservative and liberal, and regardless of their organizational mission, breathing room to communicate about candidates for public office. At the same time, the law will continue to prevent tax-exempt organizations from financing a candidate or buying political advertisements to get the candidate elected. Doing good in society should not engender muzzle, and the political speech rights of churches and nonprofit leaders should be restored by rolling back the Johnson Amendment through the Free Speech Fairness Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Engelbrecht, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Catherine Engelbrecht, citizen of Cat Spring, Texas. I am also the founder of True the Vote, a national 501c3 organization dedicated to the advancement of voters' rights and election integrity. Given that the topic for today's hearing is examining a church's right to free speech, I particularly thank you for the invitation to participate because, although I am a Christian, I am not here to speak on behalf of the church. As it happens, religious organizations and charitable organizations like True the Vote share the same nonprofit class designation, which means we are held to the same standard in the eyes of the IRS. So that is what brings me to this chamber, to share the story of my experiences with the Internal Revenue Service, an agency that I have found to be so emboldened through the years of partisan exploitation that it now presumes itself to be America's arbiter of free speech. So in 2010, I filed a 501c3 nonprofit application with the IRS on behalf of True the Vote. Since that filing, my private businesses, my nonprofit organization, and I personally have been subjected to more than 15 instances of audit, inquiry, or investigation by federal agencies, including the IRS, OSHA, the ATF, and the FBI. These inquisitions began only after my filing of True the Vote's application for tax exemption, an act that unwittingly put me and my organization on the radical radar of a political machine that seemed to place its own survival above the rights of its citizens. Politicians have long used the IRS to intimidate their enemies, and an entrenched agency bureaucrat is all too willing to play as the enforcer. So it is now, and so it was in 1954 when the Johnson Amendment became part of the IRS Revenue Code. Today, abetted by the Johnson Amendment, the IRS can and does dictate who can speak, what they can say, and to whom they can say it. Under the current code, if your 501c3 organization operates to further purposes of religion, or charity, or science, or education, then this vaguely worded passage baked into a 46,000-page federal code lays in wait for you to muzzle you and to rescind your nonprofit status should you say something that the government doesn't like. In my case, the IRS sought to control my organization's speech from the outset, even before they had given us our 501c3 tax designation. In a letter dated February 8, 2012, one of the many letters we received from the IRS over nearly 3 years of our inexplicably protracted application process, the IRS commanded True the Vote to submit the time, date, location, and to whom we would be delivering detailed contents of speeches for all events that we had held since the inception of the organization and for every future event to be held over the next 2 years. They said that this information was necessary in order to complete their consideration of our application for exemption. It was necessary, in their view, to examine everything we had ever said and to control everything we had yet to say. We declined to comply, and in return, our exemption was withheld for another year and a half. Finally, we had no choice but to file a lawsuit against the IRS in the hopes of bringing an end to the abuse. This battle has now gone on for 7 very long years, and it continues to this day. In fact, just 3 weeks ago, my attorney and I went back into court to face 21 IRS attorneys and staffers who in legion continue to argue that they've done nothing wrong. And that is why the Johnson Amendment must be repealed, and by extension, why the tax code must be overhauled, because bureaucrats must be stripped of their deluded belief that they are sovereign, because they are not. An American citizen's right to free speech is immutable. Tax-exempt status cannot be given or taken away in exchange for that right. That's not how the Constitution should work. True the Vote story is a clear example of how the Johnson Amendment purposely was used to silence opposition, but make no mistake, we are one of many who live with this ever-present threat. It's the reason nonprofits across this country are fast becoming endangered species. They are fearful of organizing. People are scared of their government, and that is just what the autocratic deep state wants. Freedom is anathema to a government body that operates with impunity outside of our representative system. And so my recommendations to you are these. First, repeal the Johnson Amendment and do not replace it. Any replacement is only an opportunity to create more confusing loopholes. Next, amend the tax code to include a policy which clearly and unquestionably prohibits viewpoint discrimination and holds accountable any government employee or contractor who violates that policy. Make it known that the old ways have come to an end. Free speech must be preserved. It's worth testifying to, it's worth fighting for, because in the end, this is all about liberty, and it is never wrong to return liberty to the people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well said. Thank you, Ms. Engelbrecht. Ms. Holcomb, we're going to try to, they just called votes, but I think we can get through our next 2 witnesses and then get to votes. Hit that button.
Let's try this again. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the first 200 years of our nation's history, America's churches enjoyed their right to free speech. They guided their people on the important issues of their day, religious, cultural, and yes, even political. They applied Scripture to every aspect of life, including candidates and elections. But since 1954, that right has been denied to America's churches. With one last-minute amendment, one voice vote, and one stroke of the pen, the church's voice was silenced. And instead, one of the most powerful and unaccountable bureaucracies in the federal government, the IRS, was given the authority to censor the church. For over 60 years, the Johnson Amendment has caused pastors to chill their speech. They're fearful. They want to faithfully preach the whole counsel of God, but don't want to risk intrusive IRS audits, crippling financial penalties, and even their church's tax-exempt status, so they stay silent. Alliance Defending Freedom has been involved in the effort to free the pulpit from IRS censorship for nearly a decade now. We've concluded that not only does the Johnson Amendment harm real people, real churches, but it violates the Constitution as well. And I want to highlight just 2 of those constitutional violations. First, the Johnson Amendment is unconstitutionally vague. No one, including tax experts, legal experts, and certainly not busy pastors, knows with any real certainty where the boundaries of that law are. Of course, explicit candidate endorsements are prohibited, but as explained in greater detail in my written testimony, just about anything beyond that is a mystery. The IRS guidance on this issue is increasingly vague and confusing. And to make a bad situation worse, IRS enforcement has been sporadic and inconsistent. Some churches openly endorse or oppose political candidates, and the IRS says nothing. Other churches make a passing reference to how Jesus might view a particular policy issue, and they trigger IRS harassment and audits. The Constitution requires that its citizens be reasonably informed of what the law requires, and the Johnson Amendment fails this standard abysmally. Second, the Johnson Amendment violates free speech. Churches have a right to speak freely without fearing government censorship. No one surrenders their constitutional rights simply by walking through the church doors, and no church should be forced to surrender its free speech in exchange for a tax status. The IRS has been transformed into the speech police, censoring even what a pastor preaches from the pulpit. For example, as my colleague mentioned earlier, a pastor at All Saints Episcopal Church in Pasadena, California, preached a sermon that included critiques of the president's policies based on that minister's deeply held religious convictions. The IRS pounced and started harassing the church with an investigation, forcing that church to hire tax attorneys to defend itself. But then, after nearly 2 years of this ordeal, the IRS abruptly closed out the file without explanation. It left the church with no greater clarity on the legal boundaries of the law than when the whole ordeal started. All of this has resulted in pervasive chill and self-censorship among America's churches in violation of their right to free speech. In conclusion, the status quo is untenable, and America's churches are looking to you, their elected representatives, for help. We cannot leave this to the judicial branch to resolve. No court has yet ruled on the constitutionality of the Johnson Amendment's application to a pastor's sermon, likely because federal law allows the IRS to control when and with whom and how it gets into federal court. Since 2008, Alliance Defending Freedom has encouraged a legal challenge to the Johnson Amendment through our Pulpit Initiative, but the IRS has refused. So it's time for Congress to act. The Free Speech Fairness Act is the best solution that we at Alliance Defending Freedom have seen to these constitutional problems. The bill creates a much-needed relief valve for free speech. It allows churches to once again speak as they would in the ordinary course of their ministries without fearing IRS retribution. And such a legislative fix would allow America's churches to once more guide their congregations as the Constitution permits and as their religious beliefs require. Thank you.
Thank you. Rabbi, fire away.
Mr. Chairman and ranking members and members of the committee, I'm really honored to be here with you today. And I thank you all for your support of my work as serving as U.S. Ambassador for International Religious Freedom. I do want to single out Mr. Meadows, who is extraordinary in the work that he has done in that field. Let me just lift up a few of the key concerns here, and the concerns for the houses of worship, for the clergy. First, how divisive this will be to bring into our houses of worship the notion of endorsing candidates and dividing those houses of worship along political lines. We have enough divisions over theology, music, sermons, etc., without adding this into the mix here. Where do you draw the line? What is a pastor to do if a congregant who's a major donor says, I'll give you the gift this year, but only if you endorse such a candidate? What do you do if the pastor endorses one candidate who thinks is worthy, and then someone else wants someone else, or a member of their congregation asks? What if two members of their congregations are running against each other? And this is the pastor having responsibilities to both sides here. What do you do in these situations? It takes us down a very divisive and dangerous path in terms of the well-being of congregation, which is why there's so many polls that show overwhelming clergy don't want this. National Association of Evangelical 2 months ago, in its Evangelical Leaders Poll, 90% don't want this. The Lifeway Christian polling entity polls, 90% of clergy don't want this. And you can go down the polling data. 66% of Trump voters don't want it. 62% of identified Republicans say this would be bad. That shouldn't be determinative, but you should, I hope, ask why. And how do we deal with what their concerns are? Secondly, do we agree on the description? I don't know where the line is between the argument that right now pastors have and clergy have of all kind free speech, and churches have free speech in the sense they can talk about issues. They can speak out on the great moral issues of the day, on political issues. They can talk about issues that candidates raise. They can talk about anything that they want to do. They can hold candidate forums. They can get people to the polls. They can do all kinds of activity. As individuals, clergy can do what everyone else can do: endorse, oppose a candidate, run for office. Many clergy serve in office while they're serving their churches. I understand what this debate is over, but it sounds to me it is over a very limited area where it's being described as being a pervasive area. Do we agree on that limit? And if so, then it's a respectful difference between those who say this is free speech and those who say you have that speech. What isn't involved is the right of people to do that electoral work with subsidies from the government. The Supreme Court has held that tax exemptions and deductible gifts constitute subsidies by the government. That is the law right now. And it is upheld that such restrictions apply to what we're talking about today. If that is the debate, to us this is about subsidies and whether or not people have a right to have subsidies. Dr. King served his entire career with the Johnson Amendment in effect. He was never restrained in what he could do. He never complained about infringements on his religious freedom because of the Johnson Amendment. And I don't know many clergy who do in that regard, other than the question whether they can endorse candidates with government subsidies paying for it. Third, this idea of whether or not, if you do away with the Johnson Amendment altogether, whether nonprofits and churches become slush funds. Do we all agree that these would be campaign contributions that could be given through a house of worship, getting a tax deduction with no reporting to the government? Or are we going to take away some of the exemptions that houses of worship now have and force them to report the contributions of their members? Finally, there are these efforts to restrict this to just speech. But what kind of speech are we talking about? Is just sermons? Is de minimis, Mr. Heiss? Is de minimis one sermon? Is it one sentence in every sermon? Is it 50 sermons? Is it 50 bulletin articles? Is it 50 emails going out? That doesn't cost additional money to go into doing it anyway. De minimis will be no clearer than the current system is in that regard. The 501c3 partisan restrictions are not just bad, are protective of our religious communities, and changing that is not just bad legal policy, it is bad religious policy as well. And I urge you to maintain the Johnson Amendment that served so well to protect our nonprofits and houses of worship from being turned into campaign slush funds and dividing their members along partisan political lines.
Thank you, Rabbi. The committee will stand in recess 30 minutes more or less, and we got coffee and stuff. You can just, but we'll be back in 30 minutes.